Hello and welcome back to the Tiberium Armory series, today with a video on the Philadelphia, the crown jewel of GDI's space program. After the events of the First Tiberium War, GDI, still a NATO-like program existing at the auspices of the G7 countries, came to understand and underline the advantages of a more unified command structure. GDI as a program had proven its resourcefulness in the war, but with Kane dead and Nod now making up a defeated but massive portion of the world's population, the leaders of the free world realized the necessity for a centralized command and control of their armed forces of the G7 countries. During the years of conflict, command of GDI forces was spread out between the constituent countries at first and gradually became more centralized as the United States, the country in the G7 with the most combat experience at the beginning of the war, began to lead. The United States, the primary funding source of the GDI and the source of most of its advanced technology, who had for the decades between when Tiberium first fell in 1995 and the war's start in 2019, had begun building the rudimentary ion cannon network, a network of satellite weapons built initially as a form of anti-nuclear missile defense, and by extension of this project had built a large framework for working on and building in space. In the fusion of these two projects, a more unified command structure and development of space superiority systems, the Philadelphia was first conceived. Likely a brainchild of General James Solomon, although this was never attributed to him, the Philadelphia was a very large space station, dwarfing the International Space Station in size, made to hold many crew members year-round for operations control across the entire globe. From here, the ion cannon network could be controlled and directed, and it was likely from here that other spaceborne assets were launched during the Second Tiberium War. Top generals, senior staff, and many others whose lives were vital to the cause of GDI could be kept here as the war progressed, and the top scientists working on Tiberium abatement routinely met aboard to discuss the future of the world. The Philadelphia was the first space station of its kind, completely hardened against the effects of radiation, and equipped with extremely powerful and sensitive communications equipment on board that allowed it to penetrate through even the most intense ion storms blanketing a battlefield. The Philadelphia had no defensive systems, as indeed it needed none. Its primary defensive systems were the men and women of GDI armed forces, its spy satellites, and its fists, the mighty ion cannons placed above every continent of the world. Indeed, many at GDI likely thought that the station was invulnerable, as any missile attempting to hit it would have to run the gambit of hundreds of defensive missile systems, ion cannons, and then finding the Philadelphia itself as it hurtles around the Earth at thousands of miles per hour. It did indeed fall, eventually, but when it did, it didn't fall to the brute force of an attack crossing these formidable defenses, but instead to a subterfuge by one of Kane's greatest minds, and one of my favorite characters in all of the Tiberium universe. The construction of the Philadelphia was a monumental task in many ways, as its construction required mastering many new types of technology and manufacturing techniques on Earth and in orbit that are far, far beyond anything that is available today. The space station itself likely holds the mass of an aircraft carrier, being relatively comparatively sized to one, and that much mass making up into space with the current shuttle program is a frankly laughable idea in any sort of reasonable time frame. For reference, the maximum payload of a shuttle today to get to low Earth orbit is around 50,000 pounds, with estimates of cost ranging between $10,000 to $30,000 per pound per flight. This translates onto a rough estimate of between 500 million to 1.5 billion USD per load. The Gerald R. Ford aircraft carrier, which I am comparing the size of the Philadelphia to, weighs over 100,000 tons. This means, with a maximum capacity per shuttle of about 20 tons, it would take roughly 4,000 flights to get to that material up into space, costing between $2 trillion to $6 trillion to bring just the material into space. Before anything else about the project could be greenlit, the cost of the project would likely have had to have been addressed. A 2025 U.S. defense budget is around $849 billion. The lower estimate for the cost here is similar to the projected cost of the F-35 program, costing $2.1 trillion, the cost of which is slated to be spread out between the initialization of the program and 2088. But in the case of the Philadelphia, the timeline is shorter because it had to have been finished and online well before the Second Tiberium War. This would be between 2022, when the First War roughly ends, and the start of the Second War in 2030, roughly 8 years, for the entire $2 trillion to be spent. Now, GDI would have more than just the defenses spending of USA to work with, but that is still a vast amount of money to be spent with just a short time window. In tandem with the last video on the Kodiak, sometime between the landing of Tiberium and the First Tiberium War, the first versions of the Kodiak as a transport vehicle were likely created and used to transport materials for the ion cannon network. Hundreds of tons of materials needed to be transported to space, and the extremely costly shuttle program is simply not cost-effective enough to do the job. As a side note for everyone watching, a big reason why the space program in real life never really continued past a certain point towards the goals of the citizen of Cold War world, colonizing the moon or creating the Star Trek future, has to do with the cost of every aspect of spaceflight. Putting the man on the moon was an effort more monumental than anyone really realizes. And without the threat of the Soviet Union winning the dominance war in space, something like that would probably have never been attempted, at least that early on. We take for granted that in these Star Wars or Star Trek future science fiction settings that these huge vehicles can lift off and travel into space without the use of incredibly expensive booster rockets or tech so advanced and costly that despite how useful it might be, it would never be invested in. In the first Star Wars movie, we see X-Wings fly straight up into the air, lifted by repulsor technology, a tech that is essentially anti-gravity, rendering an incredibly heavy fighter jet nearly weightless for the liftoff process. Approximating this in real life is unbelievably difficult, with only the most expensive and complex planes in the world capable of it, and only the most skilled pilots capable of flying them. The backblast from these VTOL engines on these planes could cause harm to people and objects below them, and they are unbelievably loud. The X-Wing is nearly silent, and creates no backblast, takes off with no visible effort. Replicating this in real life would cause an overnight catapulting of humanity into space forever. If the cost of the shuttle program were to drop dramatically, or for the relative cost of a few space shuttle launches, a vehicle that could do this at nearly any weight could be produced, the universe would open up for exploitation and exploration. That's what makes the Kodiak vehicle so incredibly important to the setting. It quite literally is the only way that the space assets seen in the universe of the game could exist in the way that they do. Now, the Kodiak is not the X-Wing. It is undoubtedly an expensive machine, extremely loud in transit, and complex as all hell. It creates huge amounts of backsplash. It is not nimble, but without it, the GDI could not function as a military the way it does. So much of the doctrine of the GDI relies on the exploitation of space, and the ability to bring hundreds of tons of material into space so easily is the reason why it happens. The Philadelphia is a direct benefiter of the technology developed in the Kodiak program and the family of vehicles. Without it, the material could not have made it into space in time. But also, without it, the advancements in space to learn how to weld parts or manufacture materials in space could not have been made. Creating factories, making discoveries in space requires a tremendous amount of people and funding to do it in such a short time. And thankfully for the future of the Earth, Philadelphia had access to both. The funding that would have gone to the shuttle program now went into the Kodiak platforms and experimentation. The funding was already quite large, considering the Cold War with the greatest enemy that the Alliance had ever faced in history was still raging on. A significant portion of the GDP of every member country was going into R&D, and GDI, in particular, the USA, was spending that on weaponizing space. Year after year, hundreds of tons of material went into space, dozens, then hundreds of people, factories were built, weapons mounted, and the arsenal of freedom was built in the heavens, while nods scrambled about in the underworld. A major factor in commissioning of the space station was the influence of the MCV on the manufacturing cultures of the world. This is something that I will have to do in a coming video, go over the MCVs again and examine their place in both the battlefield and the world. But MCVs, being able to convert Tiberium into nearly any material or product with nanomachines and enough time, were instrumental in the construction of the space station, but also presented a justification for its existence. With the introduction of MCVs into the world, combat became much more dynamic and much faster paced. A single MCV smuggled behind enemy lines could, in extremely short order, create a base that could endanger hundreds of miles around it, and with its ability to repack, communicating with and coordinating combat in all these places across the world became difficult with just the infrastructure of the old world. The Philadelphia, undoubtedly with a network of relay satellites, could cut through even the toughest interference and to communicate with any unit of soldiers in the world, to give orders to commanders or to bring in support. In the Second War, alongside the strikes on the Mammoth Mk2 Walker sites, an attempt was made to destroy the Philadelphia, and it is no wonder because in the Third War, when it was destroyed in Copperhead's genius attack, GDI became extremely vulnerable. With the Energy Summit happening, nearly all of GDI's command and control staff were aboard, including their civilians, leading to a much easier and more successful invasion of DC and other blue zones. Without this, it is unlikely that Kane's plan could have been successful, as by this point, even without the absolute cutting-edge GDI tech from the Second War around anymore, GDI was simply far too entrenched to be defeated in an effort like the Second War. GDI, after a decade or more of Kane being gone, had reduced its military budget, absorbed all member countries, and occupied huge swaths of the world. It had regained the oceans, and the Tiberium abatement options meant that its coffers were overflowing. What it needed in that moment was a decapitating strike, and with the Philadelphia, GDI's greatest weapon, was also their greatest weakness. Nonetheless, GDI, after patching into the relay satellites, were able to quite quickly push back Nod, and during a world war with their greatest enemy, defeat a comically superior force of visitor attackers, ridding the world of nearly all of their forces and chasing them back to a singular point before they turned tail and ran. The ion cannon, the mammoth tank, the walkers, the armor, the weapons, none of it would have made a difference in the Second War or the Third War without the impact of the Philadelphia, a command and control center that acted as GDI's cane, a voice from the heavens that gave GDI singular focus and purpose, cutting through the fog of war and making victory all but certain for the war machine of the free world. At the end here, I'd like to thank everybody who stuck around to watch. I want to try to get back to posting a video every week or every 2 weeks again. I, over the last few weeks, had issues with my computer and then issues over a couple of weekends getting time to do the writing, but I'd like to start posting more often again. So here's to that. I want the next video to maybe be about other aspects of the space program, or perhaps a longer video on the MCV. I'm still working on the Soviet Century videos. That's writing for that is getting done a little bit at a time. And I really appreciate people who have stuck around until now, and any new people that might stumble upon this. This channel is sort of going to be a hobby thing I do in the background, and not really going to treat it like a potential future job like I was before. Anyway, thank you to everybody watching. I hope you have a wonderful day, and this is Game Master Kerrigan signing off.